Hi, Neil Shearing here from Epicentering. Today I'd like to share with you 5 signs that someone's depressed. I think it's really important to go over these because often the person who's depressed will not notice these symptoms within themselves. It's hard to explain, but depression can come on so slowly and gradually that initially you don't know that there's a problem, and by the time there is a problem, you've lost the cognitive ability to figure out what's going on. So it's really important that other people are aware of the signs of depression and can help the person that's starting to struggle. Okay, so I think the first sign here is the most important one, and that is an inability to cope with the world. So if a person's suffering from depression, they will be in a situation that they think they can't cope with, and they will probably think is their fault. So internally, they will be beating themselves up for not being stronger, braver, able to do more work, able to take on more stuff, able to cope. And this is kind of like the apex of the pyramid. Everything flows from this, and an inability to cope with the world. So if you see someone who's struggling, they may use words like burnout, stress, stuck, then they're struggling to deal with the circumstances that they're in. They're struggling to cope with their world as they see it. I think that's probably the most important sign. And it can appear in a raft of different ways, but the underlying message is that they're struggling to cope with the world. So there's 2 ways that this inability to cope with the world can be alleviated. First of all, by reinforcing the person's ability to cope with the world. It just comes at you one day at a time. If one day at a time is too much, 1 hour at a time or 1 minute at a time, you can get through each minute just breathing and allowing yourself to focus just on the here and now. So reinforcing the person's ability to cope with the world, and also, if possible, to change the experience that they're having. So if they're doing way too much at work, having a compromise with the boss that they need to take some time off or reduce their workload, or other people stepping forward to take some of the weight off of the person's shoulders. So either changing the world itself, what's going on in that person's world, or changing how they feel about their ability to cope with the world, and preferably both. So here I've listed a few of the things that the depressed person will probably be doing if they feel they've got an inability to cope with the world. So how it will be seen by people around the person who's experiencing depression. The person who's depressed will appear frustrated, irritable, and angry at the world. It's very important, if you're around someone who's depressed, that you try not to take it personally. That person who's depressed is frustrated at the world. They will not discriminate if they're having a really bad time as to what's causing it. They're not having a go at you. They're not frustrated at you. They're frustrated at the world and their inability to cope with it. And they're probably locked in a cycle of self-blame. So they will appear frustrated and angry, irritable with the world. They will try to escape from the world. My choice of things to do to escape from the world was to play video games. That was a safe, controlled environment where I felt that nothing was going to go wrong for those moments that I was in the video game. Because it was very simplistic, it was very on rails, and it was quite calming. So other people will have other ways of escaping from the world. And these are the usual vices, such as comfort eating, watching television, gambling, shopping, all the different things that people do for a quick boost. People with depression will probably latch onto as a way of escaping from the world, and they may do them to extremes. So that is often like the first sign, even drug addiction, alcohol, smoking, things like that. If it gets out of hand, that can be what people present with, but the depression is the underlying cause because the person is trying to escape from the world. And then also to withdraw from the world. So they will not be interested generally in doing social activities or doing hobbies or doing anything that previously they engaged with the world and did and enjoyed. Those things will be turned off and will not give the depressed person the same enjoyment or pleasure that they used to have. So frustrated or angry with the world, escaping from the world, and withdrawing from the world. All because of an inability to cope with the world as it is. Okay, so the second thing on the list is persistent negativity. So the person will change and they will not recognize that they've changed. So they may become cynical, envious, jealous. They may have slowed thoughts, slowed speech, slowed actions. They may have lack of imagination, of curiosity, of spirit, lack of drive, motivation, and personality. So it would be very hard to be around the person as this depression progresses. But if you can kind of catch the earliest symptoms, then that's the best time to catch and treat depression. But over time, the person will become progressively more cynical, envious, jealous, and lacking things. Is a huge part of depression. Is the person will appear to be lacking things, lacking enjoyment, lacking motivation, lacking curiosity, lacking imagination. All these things are being lost to the person, and the problem is inside their head they don't recognize that they've lost these things. It's like a cognitive impairment. The ability to be self-aware and to recognize who you are is progressively lost. So the idea of curiosity is lost. The idea of imagination is lost. And it's very difficult then for that person to see from within the change that's happening. But it might be more obvious to the people on the outside, and at that point it's important to try to get the person help for depression. This is one of the signs: persistent negativity. Okay, so the next sign is control. If a person who's never been particularly controlling in the past suddenly starts becoming controlling, or not necessarily suddenly, but over time becomes more controlling, there's a huge desire in someone who's suffering from depression to leave everything the same because they don't have the ability, or they feel like they don't have the ability to cope with the world. And that's as it is. So please don't change anything. If anything changes, it becomes more difficult to cope with because suddenly it's not how it was. So it's become more complicated. Then you've introduced not only all these variables that the person's struggling to cope with, but you've changed one. Don't change anything. And it sounds so controlling, but it's vital because that person is like scrabbling on the edge of a cliff, fearful they're going to go over, and is taking all their energy, all their effort to stay exactly where they are, scrabbling on the edge of a cliff. And then if anything happens, like a puff of wind, like, that's it. That's just going to send me over the edge. The merest hint of a puff of wind would be terrifying. Or even someone appearing below and started shouting. They might be shouting something helpful, but if you're in that second where you're scrabbling on the edge of the cliff and you think you're going over, you don't want any extra variables. So, yeah, everything must stay the same. Change is seen as destabilizing, stressful, and resisted. But everything staying the same means actually doing nothing or very little. So if you look at it from the outside, the person, like myself, playing video games, they look like they're doing nothing. But that's because they are 100% focused on avoiding the world because it's too much to cope with. So they pair back and pair back and pair back, but things get worse and worse and worse. So everything has to stay the same. We'll try and take variables away, to alleviate the stress. No, I won't do this. I won't do that. I can't do this. I can't do that. Not today. Because we're trying to take things off the plate to struggle to cope with what's going on. And so this element of control is just trying to make things stay the same. And if that's only objects and things, then while it's not ideal, it's not impacting others. But if other people are involved, that person may be perceived as trying to control other people. Like, just do this the same time every day, or do that the same time every day. Stick to a routine. Things can't be changed. But then that other person feels very put upon and controlled. So that can really impact relationships. But the person who's depressed isn't doing it for kicks or for fun or for enjoyment. They're doing it because they desperately can't cope with what's going on. And while they try to figure it out, and that's not happening, things must not change. So that's where that comes from. Okay, so loss of emotions. So it might be strikingly obvious that the person is experiencing no pleasure, no fun, no joy, no laughter, no love, no happiness, no relaxation, no contentment, no peace. So this is kind of a more traditional sign to do with depression. It's not so much about sadness and crying, although that can happen because of this is one way to release some tension and frustration. But I would imagine more common is, this is called anhedonia, no pleasure, no fun, no joy, laughter, love, happiness, relaxation, contentment, or peace. So that again makes the person exceptionally difficult to be around, but they are generally divorced from these positive feelings. They will experience quote unquote negative feelings like a sense of worthlessness, overwhelming disappointment, powerlessness, but they won't want to experience those feelings, so those are shut off. And as those are shut off, then the positive emotions are shut off too. So the person is that's where the feelings of numbness and lifelessness come from, that the person is completely shut off from their feelings. So a loss of emotions, a loss of feelings. And finally, so this video doesn't go on for about 3 hours, rejection of everything. So as I was talking about earlier, the person is struggling to cope with life. They want everything to stay the same, and so they reject any other variables that come near them. And that will look like they don't want to be around people, they don't want to go anywhere, and they don't want to interact with the world. So it's a case of, I can't cope with what's going on, therefore I want everything simplified, and don't change everything while I'm trying to simplify it to reach a level that I can cope with. Unfortunately, as progression develops, that way of dealing with the world doesn't really work. The depression gets worse, the person shrinks, the depression gets worse, the person shrinks. So it's kind of a self-propagating thing that gets worse and worse and worse. But what it will look like from the outside is the person rejecting everything. And again, it's quite important if you're around the depressed person that you try not to take it personally. They're not rejecting you personally. They're rejecting everything. So they don't want to be around people, although they're desperate for help, but they don't know how to ask for help because they can't figure out the problem. So to ask for help, you've got to say, help me with this problem. But if you can't figure out the problem, then you can't go up to someone and say, help me with life. It's difficult. But so there's a rejection of everything, a rejection of people, a rejection of going anywhere. Why would you go anywhere if A, it added to an already overflowing plate, because there's so many decisions to be made around going somewhere. Who's going to drive? What time are we leaving? Have we got to pack stuff? It's just overwhelming. And so they don't want generally to go anywhere, to do anything, because it's adding to the plate and the plate's already overspilling. So, and they don't want to interact. That's difficult. It's part of this cognitive problem that it requires decision making. Decision making becomes impossible, just impossible. But everything involves decisions. So it's part of this cognitive decline, impairment, if you like, which goes hand in hand with the emotional impairment as well. You know, if you're not going to get pleasure from these things, why do them? It's just going to add more to your plate. Well, there's no way I'm doing that then. So I hope these 5 signs give you food for thought. Whether you're just starting to suspect that you may have depression and you're starting to use words like stuck and stressed and unable to cope and things like that, then please get help, because it's much earlier, it's much easier to come out of depression at the early stages than it is after it's gone on a long time and got worse. Or you recognize the signs, you're looking for the signs in other people, and these will be some of the signs. I remember way back when someone asked me whether they thought I was depressed when I was depressed, and I thought it just meant being upset all day, crying all day, and I wasn't doing that, but I was doing a lot of these things. And that's another important point. In the early stages of depression, people can be good at masking these signs. So if you just say to someone, "How are you doing?" and they reply, "I'm fine," that's like masking if they're not fine, but they don't want to trouble other people with what's really going on. So to see these signs in the early stages, it's important to really observe people, because they may not be aware themselves. They may be busy masking, and some people are very, very good at masking, some people less so. But it can happen in the early stages because there's a real fear around not being able to identify a problem that you think you've got. Like I say, how can you ask for help with a problem you don't know you've got? I remember going to my doctor and saying, "I think I've had a breakdown." I still didn't have a clue that what I had was like depression for an awful long time. So yes, if you notice these signs, when they're obvious, then the person will probably be depressed. If they're not obvious, then it's important to try to be observant. And the more observant you are, if the person is masking, then the earliest it can be caught. And it's very important to catch depression as early as possible. Okay, I hope you found these 5 signs of depression useful. Please share this video or bookmark it, save it, tell other people about it on whatever platform you see it, and follow and subscribe, like for more in the future. Thank you very much.